Martha Jefferson stood by the window on the second floor of Monticello, her hand pressed against the cold glass. Down below, on the garden path going toward the slave houses, she watched her husband walk next to a young woman whose stomach had started to show under her simple cotton dress. Thomas did not touch her and did not look at her straight on, but there was something in the careful space he kept, exactly 3 feet. She had measured it over weeks of watching, and it told Martha everything she needed to know. She had guessed for months the way Sally Hemings moved through the house with a new kind of quiet sureness, the way Thomas's eyes would follow her when he thought no one was looking, the way talk would stop when Martha walked into a room, the way Sally's dresses had been made bigger twice in just as many months. The stitches were carefully hidden but easy to see for someone who knew what to look for. But guessing and knowing are very different things. Martha looked at her own face in the glass, pale, thin, worn out by 6 pregnancies and the constant pain in her chest that the doctors could not explain. She was 33 years old but looked 50. Sally Hemings was 16 and shined with youth and health and something else, something that should have belonged only to Martha. The glass fogged up with her breath. When it cleared, Thomas and Sally were gone around the corner of the buildings. Martha stood there for another hour, watching the empty path until the sun started to go down and the shadows got long across the Virginia hills. That night, she started writing letters she would never send, letters that would disappear along with her, leaving behind only questions that would echo through hundreds of years. What happened to Martha Jefferson in the spring of 1782? Why did a woman who had never left her husband's side suddenly vanish from all records for 3 important months? And why, when she finally showed up again, was she a completely different person, silent, empty, as if something important had been taken out of her? The answers lie buried in the red soil of Virginia, in the spaces between what history wrote down and what actually happened. This is the story of a wife, a slave, a founding father, and a secret so dangerous that it had to be wiped from every paper, every letter, every memory. But secrets, like bodies, have a way of rising to the top. If you want to hear more strange stories from America's hidden past, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell, because what you are about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about the men who built this country. Monticello, in early 1782, was not yet the great building it would become. The main house was still being built, a work always in progress that showed Thomas Jefferson's busy mind. Wood beams stuck out from unfinished walls. Work platforms clung to the west side. The smell of fresh-cut wood and wet plaster filled every room. Workers, both hired men and enslaved laborers, moved through the building like ghosts, building the monument that would eventually trap them all in different ways. Thomas Jefferson, then 38 years old, had returned from his hard time as Virginia's wartime governor to find his home half built and his wife getting sicker. The Revolutionary War still raged, though the fighting had moved south. British forces under Cornwallis had invaded Virginia the year before, forcing Jefferson to run from Richmond in what his enemies called fear and his friends called caution. The event had left him shaken, eager to hide in private life and the book learning that had always been his true love. But private life at Monticello was not peaceful. Martha Wales Skelton had married Thomas 10 years earlier in 1772, bringing with her not only a lot of money, but also 135 enslaved people from her father's estate. Among them was the Hemings family Elizabeth Hemings and her children, including a daughter named Sally, who was just a baby then. The whispers about the Hemings family had started long before Martha married Thomas. Everyone in Virginia society knew, though no one spoke of it openly, that Elizabeth Hemings's children were fathered by John Wales, Martha's father, which meant that Elizabeth's daughter Sally was Martha's half, Easter, connected by blood, but separated by the cruel rules of slavery. Martha had grown up knowing this. She had watched her father move between the main house and the slave quarters with the casual right of a man who owned not just labor but bodies, futures, and bloodlines. She had seen her mother's face grow tight and far away whenever Elizabeth Hemings appeared. She had learned early that some truths were admitted through silence rather than speech. When Martha's mother died, John Wales had taken Elizabeth Hemings as his partner openly. No longer bothering to hide it, he fathered 6 more children with her. Each one was a living reminder of the system's deep wrongness. Martha, barely a teenager, had been forced to accept these half-siblings as property, to give them orders, to take part in the lie that blood meant nothing when it crossed the color line. She had promised herself that her own marriage would be different, that Thomas, with his new ideas about freedom and human worth, would never copy her father's behavior. She had been wrong. The plantation ran with the hard speed common to Virginia estates of the time. Nearly 200 enslaved people worked the tobacco fields, the vegetable gardens, the nail factory, the cloth shop, and the house itself. They built the walls that would hold them. They cooked the food for tables they would never sit at. They raised children who would never be their own. They created wealth they would never use, building an empire of ideas about freedom on a foundation of chains. Thomas Jefferson kept careful notes of everything: crop amounts, weather patterns, building progress, the births and deaths of enslaved people, tracked with the same care he gave to his garden vegetables. His books from this time survive in various archives, thousands of pages of careful notes about dirt and building ideas and thoughts on freedom and the search for happiness. But from March through May of 1782, there are only blank pages. 12 weeks of quiet in a record that was otherwise fully complete. 12 weeks that Thomas Jefferson wanted wiped from history. Martha had given birth to their 6th child, Lucy Elizabeth, in May of 1781. The birth had been hard, made worse by Martha's weak health and the poor medical care available even to rich families. The doctor had used tools causing inside injuries that never healed right. Martha bled for weeks afterward, losing so much blood that she could not stand without fainting. She lived, but she never got better. She spent most days in bed, too weak to walk more than a few steps without help. The pain in her stomach was constant, a dull hurt that turned sharp whenever she moved. The doctors came and went, a line of men with sure guesses and useless cures. They gave her laudanum for the pain, which helped but left her mind cloudy and far away. They ordered blood letting for the weakness, which only made her weaker. They ordered bed rest and fresh air and various drinks that tasted like poison and probably were. Nothing helped. Martha was dying slowly and everyone knew it. Thomas hired extra house servants to care for her. Sally Hemings, who had just turned 15, was brought up from the weaving house where she had been learning cloth work. She was given light jobs, bringing meals to Martha's room, changing sheets, reading out loud when Martha's eyes grew too tired, sitting quietly in case Martha needed anything. Sally was unusually pretty with light skin from her white father and fine features that made visitors mistake her for a member of the family rather than property. She had hazel eyes, which were rare in the slave quarters, and hair that fell in soft waves rather than tight curls. She was also smart, quick to learn, watchful in a way that made some people uneasy. She could read, a skill Elizabeth Hemings had secretly taught her children despite the laws against slave reading. She could play the harpsichord, having learned by listening to Martha's lessons and practicing when the family was away. Martha, in her sickness, grew fond of the girl. Sally reminded her of herself at that age, before marriage, before children, before the slow loss of hope that comes from loving a man who loves ideas more than people. She taught Sally French, reading to her from Voltaire and Rousseau, finding it strange to teach freedom thoughts to a girl who had no rights at all. They would sit together for hours, Martha in her bed and Sally in a chair beside it, talking about ideas that both of them knew would never change Sally's basic status as property. But Thomas saw something different in Sally, something that would destroy everything. It began in February of 1782, during one of the coldest winters Virginia had seen in decades. Ice formed on the inside of windows, creating crystal shapes that looked like frozen flowers. The James River froze solid for the first time in living memory, thick enough that people walked across it. The enslaved people in the quarters burned through their small wood supplies in the first 2 weeks and spent the rest of the winter huddled together for warmth, wearing every piece of clothing they owned. 3 children died of sickness in a single week. Their bodies were buried in ground so frozen that the diggers had to light fires to soften the earth enough to dig. Martha's condition got worse with the cold. She could no longer leave her bed at all. Her skin took on a gray color that made her look like she was already dead. Her breathing became hard work, each breath a visible effort. She coughed all the time, bringing up blood that stained her cloths. The doctors said it was consumption, though they could not explain why the usual cures had no effect. They began to speak in quiet voices about making her comfortable, about getting the family ready for the end. Thomas spent his days in his study, supposedly working on changes to the Virginia legal code. He had been asked to fix the state's laws to bring them in line with new principles. It was work that should have taken all his time, the kind of mind challenge he usually loved. But the house servants noticed that he seemed distracted, that pages sat on his desk for days without being touched, that he stared out the window for hours at a time. They also noticed that Sally Hemings was often sent to bring him tea, to fix his fire, to deliver messages that could have been delivered by anyone, and they noticed that these tasks took longer than they should. Sally would disappear into the study with a tea tray and not come out for an hour. The door would be closed. No sounds would come from inside. And when Sally finally came out, her face would be red, her hair slightly messy, her eyes carefully avoiding everyone else's look. The other house servants began to whisper. Betty Brown, who had served the Jefferson family for 20 years, told her daughter that she had seen Thomas touch Sally's hand when she brought him tea, a long touch that went beyond politeness. Ursula, the cook, said she had heard voices from the study late at night, Thomas's low voice and Sally's softer answers. Martin Hemings, Sally's brother and Thomas's personal servant, said nothing, but his face grew tight and angry whenever Sally's name was mentioned. Martha noticed, too. Even through the fog of medicine, she saw the way Thomas looked at Sally. She heard the footsteps in the hallway late at night, the soft closing of doors, the whispered talks that stopped when she called out. She noticed that Sally had new dresses, better cloth than the other house servants wore. She noticed that Sally was excused from the hardest work, that she was given rights that created bad feelings among the other enslaved people, and she noticed with a sick sureness that cut through the medicine fog that Sally's body was changing. The girl's chest was fuller, her face had a certain shine, her dresses were being made bigger at the waist. Sally Hemings was pregnant. In early March, Martha called her sister, Elizabeth Epps, to Monticello. The message was urgent, carried by a rider through freezing rain. Elizabeth arrived 2 days later to find Martha in a state of upset, unusual for someone so sick. Martha was sitting up in bed, her eyes bright with fever or anger, or both. She had refused her medicine that morning, wanting her mind clear. Martha sent the servants away and spoke to her sister in urgent whispers for over an hour. The door was closed, but Betty Brown, who was cleaning in the hallway, heard bits of the talk. She heard Martha say, "Pregnant and my own house and my father's daughter." She heard Elizabeth's shocked answers, her tries to calm Martha, her ideas that Martha might be wrong, but Martha was not wrong. She had proof. She had been watching, writing down, keeping track of dates and times and things she saw in a small journal she kept hidden under her mattress. She had written down every time Sally went to Thomas's study, every time Thomas visited the slave quarters at night, every time Sally's dresses were changed. She had counted the dates and decided that Sally was about 3 months pregnant, and she had a plan. No record exists of what exactly Martha told her sister that day. But Elizabeth left Monticello that same afternoon, her face pale and tight, and she never spoke of the visit to anyone. She rode away in the rain, and she did not look back at the house. 2 days later, Sally Hemings appeared at breakfast with a bruise on her cheek, dark purple, spreading from her cheekbone to her jaw. When Betty Brown asked what happened, Sally said she had fallen on the ice. But there was no ice in the house, and Sally's eyes told a different story. They were red from crying, and they held a fear that went beyond body pain. That night, Martha Jefferson left her bed for the first time in weeks. Several servants saw her walking through the house in her nightgown, carrying a candle, moving with surprising strength for someone supposedly dying. Her face was set in a look of hard purpose. She went to Thomas's study. The door closed, voices were raised, Martha's high and sharp, cutting through the walls, Thomas's low and defending, trying to calm her. The fight lasted over an hour. Servants gathered in the hallways, pretending to work while trying to hear. They caught bits, "Your own house, my father's child, everyone will know, destroy everything," then silence, a long, terrible silence that was somehow worse than the shouting. When the door finally opened, Thomas came out alone. His face was calm, carefully blank, but his hands were shaking. He ordered all the servants to bed right away. His voice was cold, allowing no argument. The servants scattered, but they watched from windows and doorways as Thomas locked himself in his study for the rest of the night. A single candle burned in the window until sunrise. The next morning, Martha Jefferson was gone. Thomas gathered the house staff in the main hall at sunrise. His face was worn, his eyes red from lack of sleep, but his voice was steady. He announced that Martha had been taken to a special doctor in Richmond during the night. Her health had gotten worse suddenly, he explained, and she needed care that could only be found in the city. She would be gone for several weeks, possibly months. In the meantime, the house was to continue running normally, No one was to discuss Martha's absence with visitors. Anyone who spread rumors would be punished hard. The servants listened in silence. They knew better than to ask questions, but they also knew the story made no sense. First, Martha was far too sick to travel. The trip to Richmond was over 70 miles on rough roads, a trip that would take 3 days minimum in good weather. In March, with the roads muddy from rain and snow, it could take a week. The constant shaking of the carriage, the cold and damp, the lack of proper rest, any of these things could easily kill someone in Martha's state. No doctor would suggest such a trip. No husband who cared about his wife's life would allow it. Second, if Martha had truly been taken to Richmond, there would have been planning, trunks packed with her things, plans made for her care, messages sent ahead to get a room and alert the doctor. But none of this had happened. Martha's room looked exactly as it had the night before, her clothes still in the closet, her personal items still on the table. If she had left for a long stay in Richmond, she had taken nothing with her. Third, Thomas made no try to visit her. For a man supposedly devoted to his dying wife, he showed remarkable lack of care to her treatment. He remained at Monticello, watching construction, managing the plantation, and spending an unusual amount of time in the slave quarters. He sent no letters to Richmond asking about Martha's health. He received no updates from the supposed doctor. He acted like a man who knew exactly where his wife was and had no worries about her well-being. The enslaved community at Monticello had their own ideas about what happened. These ideas were passed down through generations, whispered in the quarters late at night, never written down, but never forgotten. They were shared in the careful code that enslaved people created for discussing dangerous truths, vague hints, meaningful silences, stories that seemed to be about other people, but were really about the masters. They said Martha had found out the truth about Thomas and Sally. They said she had faced him with proof that could ruin his name. A man who wrote about freedom while forcing himself on an enslaved girl who was his wife's half-sister. They said Thomas had been forced to choose between his good name and his wife, and they said he had chosen his good name. But where was Martha? If she had not gone to Richmond, where had she been taken? And why did Thomas go to such lengths to hide her location? The answer lay in a place that no longer appears on any map, a place that was purposely erased from history along with Martha herself. About 30 miles west of Monticello, deep in the mountains that formed the spine of Virginia, there was a small place called Shadwell Mills. It had been started by Peter Jefferson, Thomas's father, in the 1740s as a business idea. The place consisted of a grinding mill powered by a fast, moving creek, a few small buildings for storage and tools, and a stone house set back from the road on a small hill. The house was solid, built to last, with thick walls of local stone and a slate roof that could handle the harsh mountain winters. It had been meant as a home for the mill manager, but the mill had never made money. The place was too far away, too hard to reach, too far from the main trade roads. By 1760, the mill had been left empty. The small buildings fell apart. The stone house stood empty, slowly being taken back by the forest. Thomas got the property when his father died, but he rarely visited it. The house was alone, surrounded by thick forest, reached only by a narrow path that was often impossible in winter and spring. There were no neighbors within 5 miles. The nearest town was a 2-day ride away. It was the kind of place where a person could disappear completely. where screams would be swallowed by the forest, where no one would ever know what happened behind those thick stone walls. In March of 1782, smoke was seen rising from the stone house's chimney for the first time in years. A local hunter named William Crawford, tracking deer through the mountains, noticed it and thought it strange. He came close carefully and saw that the house had been recently used. The windows had been closed up from the inside. Fresh firewood was stacked by the door. A carriage stood in what had once been a yard now overgrown with weeds. Crawford watched from the tree line for over an hour. He saw two enslaved men from Monticello. He knew them from having sold game to the plantation, carrying supplies into the house, water from the creek, firewood, a basket that looked like it held food. They moved with the careful speed of men doing an unpleasant job, their faces set in looks of grim purpose. Then Crawford heard something that made his blood run cold, a woman's voice, high and desperate, screaming from inside the house. The words were hard to hear, but the pain was clear. The scream went on, getting higher until it cut off suddenly as if someone had covered the woman's mouth. The two enslaved men stopped what they were doing. They looked at each other, their faces carefully blank. Then they finished unloading the supplies and left, driving the carriage back down the narrow path toward Monticello. Crawford waited until they were gone, then went to the house. He tried to look through the closed windows, but they were sealed tight. He tried the door, but it was locked from the outside, a heavy lock that would need a key to open. He called out, asking if anyone needed help, but got no answer. He rode into the nearest town and mentioned what he had seen to a friend at the tavern. The friend, a man named Robert Hughes, who had business deals with Jefferson, told Crawford that he must have been wrong. There was no one at Shadwell Mills. The property had been empty for years. Perhaps Crawford had seen squatters, or perhaps the loneliness of the mountains had played tricks on his mind. But Crawford knew what he had seen, and he knew what he had heard. A woman was being held in that stone house against her will, and everyone seemed determined to pretend it wasn't happening. Within a week, rumors were spreading through Albemarle County. People whispered that Thomas Jefferson was keeping his wife prisoner in the mountains. They said Martha had gone mad and had to be tied up for her own safety. They said she had tried to kill herself and was being stopped from trying again. They said she had found out something about Thomas that he couldn't allow her to tell. Thomas moved quickly to stop the rumors. He visited Robert Hughes personally and suggested that spreading false stories about a governor's family could be considered a crime against the state in wartime Virginia. He reminded Hughes that he had the power to make life very hard for people who worked against him. Hughes understood the message and stopped talking about Shadwell Mills. Thomas also visited the tavern where Crawford had first mentioned the stone house. He spoke to the owner, a man named Samuel Porter, and made it clear that he would appreciate Porter's silence. He didn't threaten directly. Thomas Jefferson was too smooth for crude threats, but he mentioned that he was looking over the tavern licenses in the county and that some places might not meet the new standards he was thinking about. Porter got the message. When Crawford came back to the tavern and tried to talk about what he had seen, Porter told him to keep quiet. He said that some things were better left alone, that powerful men had long memories, that a hunter who wanted to keep hunting on Jefferson's land should learn when to keep his mouth shut. Crawford was offered a large payment, £50, more money than he could make in a year, to leave Virginia and start fresh in Kentucky. The money came from Thomas Jefferson's personal account, though the deal was handled through another person, so there would be no direct link. Crawford accepted. He left Virginia in April of 1782 and was never heard from again. Whether he actually made it to Kentucky or whether he met with an accident along the way, no one knows. The two enslaved men who had been put at Shadwell Mills, Jupiter Evans and George Granger, were sold to a plantation in Georgia within a month of Martha's disappearance. The sale was strange because both men were skilled workers valuable to the plantation and had families at Monticello. Selling them meant breaking up families, separating husbands from wives and fathers from children, which Thomas Jefferson publicly claimed to avoid whenever possible. But Jupiter and George knew what had happened in that stone house. They had seen Martha Jefferson in her captivity. They had heard her screams and her begs. They had been forced to take part in her holding, bringing her food and water and firewood, keeping up the lie that she was being cared for when she was really being broken. They were sent 1,000 miles away to a place where no one would believe their stories even if they dared to tell them. They were separated from everyone they knew, alone in a new and hard place, their knowledge buried with them. Jupiter died in 1790, killed in an accident at the Georgia plantation. George lived until 1808, but he never spoke about his time at Shadwell Mills. The knowledge died with him, or so Thomas Jefferson believed, but one person knew the truth. One person had been there at Shadwell Mills during those first terrible weeks. One person had seen Martha in her holding, had heard her blame and her threats, had seen the planned breaking of a woman's mind and spirit. Sally Hemings knew, and Sally Hemings was pregnant with Thomas Jefferson's child. By April, Sally's state could no longer be hidden. Her stomach grew beneath her dresses, visible to anyone who looked. The other enslaved women in the house began to whisper among themselves, their voices carrying a mix of pity and anger. Some felt sorry for Sally. She was just a child herself, barely 16, and everyone knew she had no choice in what happened to her. The master wanted her, and an enslaved woman had no right to say no. It was force by definition, though no one used that word. They called it taking advantage or having his way, or simply what masters do. Others were angry. They saw in Sally's pregnancy a kind of favor, a closeness to the master that might bring perks. Sally had already been given better rooms, excused from field work, provided with nicer clothes. Now she would have the master's child, and that child might be treated differently than other enslaved children. It created a ladder within the slave community, a split between those who had the master's favor and those who didn't. Sally herself said nothing. She moved through the house like a ghost, doing her duties with simple speed, her face carefully blank. She didn't complain about her state. She didn't ask for special treatment. She didn't tell anyone about what had happened between her and Thomas Jefferson. She simply lasted as enslaved women had lasted for generations, carrying a load she had never chosen and could never escape. Thomas said nothing publicly about Sally's state, but he made plans. Sally was moved from the main house to a small cabin near the stables, away from the other servants. The cabin was better than most slave quarters. It had a wood floor instead of dirt, a proper fireplace instead of a fire pit, a real bed instead of a straw mat. Sally was given better food, warmer blankets, and excused from all heavy work. A midwife was assigned to check on her often, ensuring that the pregnancy went normally. These small kindnesses were noted by everyone and understood by no one. Why was Thomas Jefferson taking such care of an enslaved girl's pregnancy? He had never shown such care for the dozens of other enslaved women at Monticello who had given birth over the years. Their pregnancies were written in his farm book with the same attention he gave to the raising of animals. A note about the date, the sex of the child, whether mother and baby lived. But Sally was different. Sally was receiving the kind of care usually kept for family members. The whispers grew louder. People began to guess openly about the baby's father. Some said it was Thomas Jefferson's child, pointing to the special treatment as proof. Others said that was impossible, that a man of Jefferson's standing would never stoop to such acts, that Sally must have been involved with one of the enslaved men, and Jefferson was simply being kind. But the enslaved community knew the truth. They had seen Thomas visiting Sally's cabin at night. They had seen the way he looked at her, the way he touched her hand when he thought no one was watching. They had heard Sally crying in her cabin after his visits, soft sobs that she tried to hide so no one would hear. They knew exactly what was happening, and they knew there was nothing they could do about it. In late April, a letter arrived at Monticello from Elizabeth Epps, Martha's sister. The letter was formal and cold, very different from Elizabeth's usual warm writing. She was demanding to see her sister. She had written to the supposed doctor in Richmond and received no answer. She had sent messages to several other doctors in the city asking if they were treating Martha Jefferson, and all had said that they had no such patient. She was threatening to come to Monticello herself and search for Martha, to involve other family members, to make questions with the Virginia government about where Martha was. Thomas wrote back right away. His letter, which survives in the Epps family records, is a masterpiece of misleading and soft threat. He assured Elizabeth that Martha was receiving great care, that her health was improving slowly, that she would return home as soon as she was strong enough to travel. He begged Elizabeth to be patient, to trust him, to understand that Martha needed complete rest and isolation to get better. Any interruption, any visitors, any stress could set back her recovery or even kill her. He also mentioned almost lightly that he had recently changed his will. He had made generous gifts for Elizabeth and her children, ensuring that they would be money secure even if something happened to him. He hoped she would find the plan good. He included a copy of the important parts, showing exactly how much money Elizabeth stood to get. The hint was clear. Silence could be bought. Elizabeth's help would be rewarded. Her getting involved would cost her dearly. Elizabeth did not come to Monticello, but she also did not stop asking questions. She wrote to friends in Richmond, to doctors, to anyone who might have news about Martha's location. She was careful, polite, never directly blaming Thomas of anything wrong, but her digging was dangerous. She was creating a record of her worries, a paper trail that could be used against Thomas if Martha never returned or returned in a state that raised questions. Thomas needed Martha to show up again, but the woman locked in the stone house at Shadwell Mills was no longer able to play the role of Virginia's First Lady. The servants who had been sent to care for Martha in her isolation, a changing group of enslaved women who were brought to Shadwell Mills for a few days at a time, and then returned to Monticello, brought back scary reports. They whispered to each other in the quarters late at night, sharing what they had seen in voices barely above a whisper. Martha had stopped eating. She would take a few bites of food and then push the plate away, saying it was poisoned. She had lost so much weight that her bones showed through her skin. Her hair, which had once been thick and shiny, was falling out in clumps. She had torn out patches of it herself, leaving bald spots on her head. She spent hours staring at the stone walls, not speaking, not responding to questions. Sometimes she would suddenly start talking, fast streams of words that made no sense, bits of prayers and blame and begs for mercy all mixed together. She talked about Sally, about the baby, about cheating and revenge. She talked about her father, about the Hemings family, about the deep wrongness of the system they all lived in, and she had scratched words into the stone walls with her fingernails. The women who saw these scratches were shocked. Some were Bible verses about sin and punishment. Some were words against Thomas, calling him a faker and a liar. Some were threats, promises of revenge that Martha would never be able to carry out. And some were simply, "Please let me out, please let me out, I'll be good, I'll be quiet, just let me out." Her fingernails were broken and bloody from scratching at the stone. The women tried to bandage her hands, but Martha would tear off the bandages and start scratching again. It was as if she was trying to claw her way through the walls to escape through pure force of will. A doctor was brought to check her, not a Richmond expert, but a quiet doctor from Staunton named Dr. William Carr, who was known for treating hard cases and keeping secrets. Dr. Carr spent an hour with Martha and came out looking shaken. He told Thomas that Martha was suffering from deep sadness, possibly made worse by brain fever. Her mind had been damaged perhaps forever by the mix of body sickness, emotional shock, and being alone. Dr. Carr suggested continued isolation, laudanum for upset, and prayer. He said that Martha might get better with time, or she might not. He said that bringing her back into society in her current state would be a disaster. She would make wild claims, act wrongly, shame the family. Better to keep her alone until she either got better or died. He did not suggest that she be returned to her family. He did not suggest that she be allowed visitors. He did not ask why a woman supposedly receiving medical care was being kept locked in an empty house in the mountains rather than in a proper hospital or care home. Dr. Carr was paid £100 for his visit and his silence. He returned to Staunton and never spoke of Martha Jefferson again. When he died in 1795, his personal papers were burned by his wife, who said only that her husband had treated many patients whose privacy needed to be protected even after death. But Thomas had no choice. Elizabeth's questions were drawing attention. Other family members were beginning to ask why they hadn't heard from Martha in months. Visitors to Monticello were talking about her absence, expressing worry, offering to help. The story of the Richmond doctor was becoming impossible to keep up. Someone would eventually go to Richmond and search for Martha themselves, and when they found no sign of her, the questions would become blame. In mid-May, Thomas made a choice. Martha would return to Monticello, but she would return changed, broken, unable to tell anyone what had happened to her. The question was, had she already been broken by 3 months of being alone and grief, or did Thomas take extra steps to ensure her silence? On May 20th, 1782, Martha Jefferson returned to Monticello. She arrived at dawn, brought in a closed carriage that went directly to the main house without stopping. The servants were ordered to stay in their quarters until after sunrise. No one was to see her arrival. No one was to speak of it. But enslaved people have ways of seeing things they are not supposed to see. They have to for survival. Their lives depend on knowing what the masters are doing, on guessing moods and movements, on being invisible while remaining aware of everything. A young girl named Betsy, who worked in the kitchen, was up early starting the fires for breakfast. She had to be. The bread needed to be baked, the porridge needed to be cooked, the coffee needed to be ready when the family woke. She was carrying wood from the shed to the kitchen when she saw the carriage arrive. She stopped in the shadows, making herself small and still, and watched. Thomas climbed out of the carriage first. He looked worn out, his clothes messy, his face tired. He had been gone for 2 days, supposedly on business in Charlottesville, but everyone knew he had really gone to Shadwell Mills to bring Martha home. He reached into the carriage and helped a woman out. The woman moved slowly, unsure, like someone who had forgotten how to walk. She was so thin that she looked like a skeleton dressed in clothes. Her dress hung on her frame several sizes too large. Her face was empty, her cheeks sunken, her eyes huge in her thin face. But it was her hair that shocked Betsy the most. Martha Jefferson's hair had once been thick and dark, her pride and joy. The woman who came out of the carriage had hair that was streaked with white, as if she had aged 30 years in 3 months. It was thin and brittle, and there were patches where it had fallen out completely, leaving visible scalp. Thomas held her up with one arm around her waist, practically carrying her up the steps to the house. The woman, Martha, though she barely looked like herself, didn't speak. She didn't look around. She moved like a puppet, purely following Thomas's lead, her eyes fixed on nothing. Betsy said later, much later, when she was an old woman and Thomas Jefferson was long dead and she had nothing left to fear, that the woman who returned to Monticello was not the same woman who had left. She said it was like Martha's soul had been taken out and something else put in its place, something empty and broken that wore Martha's face, but wasn't really her anymore. Martha was put in her bedroom on the 2nd floor, the same room she had used before her disappearance. But now the room had been changed. The windows had been fitted with locks on the outside. The door had a new lock as well, one that could only be opened with a key that Thomas kept on him at all times. The furniture had been cut down to basics: a bed, a chair, a small table, nothing that could be used as a weapon, nothing that could be broken into sharp pieces. A nurse was hired to care for Martha. Her name was Mrs. Abigail Randolph, a strict woman from Charlottesville who had experience with hard patients. She had worked in a private asylum in Philadelphia before returning to Virginia, and she brought with her the ways used in such places: straps for violent patients, calming drugs for upset, isolation for those who couldn't be controlled. Mrs. Randolph moved into a small room next to Martha's, connected by a door that was kept locked from the nurse's side. She was given total power over Martha's care. She decided when Martha ate, when she slept, when she was allowed out of bed. She gave laudanum several times a day, keeping Martha in a constant state of sleepiness. She kept detailed notes of Martha's condition, noting every episode of upset, every refusal to eat, every strange statement. These records survive in the Randolph family papers. They make for hard reading. Mrs. Randolph described Martha as violently upset, likely to cry fits, making wild claims against her husband, and requiring constant watching to prevent self-harm. She noted that Martha often refused food, claiming it was poisoned. She wrote that Martha had to be tied down on several occasions when she tried to leave her room or hurt herself. But the records also show something else. They show that Martha had moments of clarity, times when the laudanum wore off and her mind cleared. During these moments, she would tell Mrs. Randolph what had happened to her. She would describe her time at Shadwell Mills, the loneliness, the fear, the planned breaking of her will. She would talk about Sally Hemings and the baby, about Thomas's cheating, about her goal to show the truth. Mrs. Randolph wrote these statements in her notes, but she also noted that Martha was confused and not to be believed. She called Martha's claims the ravings of a sick mind rather than the words of a woman who had been jailed and hurt. Whether Mrs. Randolph actually believed Martha was confused or whether she was simply protecting her boss is impossible to know. The house was told that Martha's health had gotten worse during her treatment in Richmond, that she needed complete quiet and rest, that only Thomas and Mrs. Randolph were to enter her room. The servants were blocked from speaking to Martha or even noting her presence. If they heard her crying or calling out, they were to ignore it and continue with their work. For the next 3 months, Martha Jefferson was a ghost in her own home. Servants would hear her crying at night, long sobbing sounds that echoed through the hallways and made them pull their blankets over their heads to block out the sound. They would hear her calling out names, her children's names, her sister's name, and sometimes in a voice filled with hate, Sally's name. Sally, Sally Hemings, I know you can hear me. I know what you did. I know what he did. Everyone will know. I'll make sure everyone knows. Thomas spent every evening in Martha's room. The servants could hear him through the door, reading to her in low, calm tones, trying to soothe her upset. He read from the Bible, from thinking books, from poems. He spoke to her about their children, about their life together, about his love for her. He tried to reach whatever was left of the woman he had married. But they could also hear Martha's answers, blame, curses, desperate questions that Thomas never answered well. Why did you send me away? Why did you lock me in that place? What did you do to me there? What did you give me? Why won't you let me see my children? What have you told them about me? Is the baby born yet? Is it a boy or a girl? Does it look like you? Everyone will know. I'll tell everyone. You can't keep me locked up forever. Thomas's answers were always the same. He told her she was sick, that she needed rest, that she was confused and saying things she didn't mean. He told her that she would feel better soon, that she would get better, that everything would be all right. He told her that he loved her, that he had always loved her, that he had only done what was necessary to protect her and the family, but Martha didn't believe him, and she never stopped trying to escape. Martha's children had not been allowed to see her since before her disappearance. Patsy, who was 9 years old, and Polly, who was 3, were told their mother was too sick to see them. They were sent to stay with relatives. Patsy with her Aunt Elizabeth Epps, Polly with another family member. They would not see Martha again until it was too late. Patsy wrote letters to her mother, childish notes saying love and hope for her recovery. These letters were given to Thomas, who promised to read them to Martha. Whether he actually did is unknown. The letters survive in the Jefferson family papers, but there are no answers from Martha, no messages of love for her daughters, no comfort that she would see them soon, just silence. In July, Sally Hemings went into labor. The birth was hard, lasting nearly 2 days. Sally was helped by Grace, the plantation midwife, an old enslaved woman who had delivered dozens of babies at Monticello over the years. Grace had delivered Martha's children. She had delivered Sally's mother's children. She had seen generations of enslaved families born into chains, and she had learned to keep her thoughts to herself about what she saw. But what she saw during Sally's delivery shocked even her. The baby was born healthy and strong, a boy with light skin and fine features. But it was the baby's face that made Grace catch her breath. The shape of the nose, the set of the eyes, the special way the baby's hair grew at the sides, all of it was clearly familiar. The baby looked like Thomas Jefferson, not just a general likeness, but a specific, undeniable likeness that could not be explained away. Grace said nothing. She cleaned the baby, wrapped him in a blanket, and placed him in Sally's arms. Sally looked down at her son with a look that was hard to read. Love, surely, but also fear and acceptance. This baby would be a living reminder of what had been done to her. This baby would tie her to Thomas Jefferson for the rest of her life. Sally named her son Thomas, though everyone called him Tom. The baby was healthy and strong, and Sally got better quickly from the birth. She was young and strong, her body bouncing back from the shock of childbirth with the ease of youth. Thomas visited the cabin once the day after the birth. He stayed for less than 5 minutes. He looked at the baby, said nothing, and left. He never held his son. He never claimed him publicly, but he made plans. Sally and her baby were moved to a better cabin, one with 2 rooms instead of 1, with a proper fireplace and wooden floors and real windows with glass instead of shutters. Sally was given a small allowance, a few coins each month, unheard of for an enslaved person. She was provided with better clothing, better food, better everything. And it was quietly understood, though never officially stated, that Sally's children would never be sold, would never be separated from her, would be treated differently than other enslaved children at Monticello. These were not kindnesses. They were payments, pay for silence, a deal between a man with total power and a woman with none. Because Sally knew what had happened to Martha. Sally had been there at Shadwell Mills during those first terrible weeks of Martha's holding. She had been forced to serve Martha, to bring her food and water, to clean up after her, to listen to her ravings and her begs, and Sally had heard things that no one else had heard. Truths, threats, plans for revenge that Martha whispered in her clear moments. Plans that scared Sally because she knew Martha was able to carry them out, even in her broken state. Martha knew about the pregnancy. Martha knew the baby was Thomas's, and Martha had promised Sally that she would make them both pay, that she would find a way to show the truth, that she would destroy Thomas's name, even if it cost her own life. Sally was scared. She had no power to protect herself or her baby. She was completely dependent on Thomas's goodwill, and she knew that goodwill could disappear at any moment. She had seen what Thomas did to Martha when Martha became a problem. What would he do to Sally if she became a threat? So Sally stayed quiet. She accepted the better cabin and the small allowance and the promises about her children. She played the role of the grateful slave, the willing partner, the woman who had no complaints about her situation. She buried her fear and her anger and her knowledge deep inside where no one could see it. But she never forgot, and she never forgave. On September 6th, 1782, Martha Jefferson died. The official cause of death was listed as problems from childbirth. The birth of Lucy Elizabeth 15 months earlier had weakened her beyond repair, and she had finally given in to the long decline. But the timing was odd. Martha had survived for months in her bad state, clinging to life with a grip that surprised everyone. Why did she die exactly when she did, just as her sister Elizabeth was planning another visit to Monticello, just as questions about her state were becoming harder to dodge, just as the story of her illness was becoming impossible to keep up. The servants who prepared Martha's body for burial noticed things that upset them. They whispered about these things among themselves, but never to anyone outside the slave community. They knew better than to voice doubts about a master's behavior. Betty Brown, who had served Martha for years, was one of the women who washed and dressed the body. She noticed bruises on Martha's arms, dark purple marks that looked like fingerprints, as if someone had held her down with great force. She noticed a strange smell on Martha's breath, bitter and chemical, not the usual smell of laudanum, and she noticed Martha's face frozen in a look that was not peaceful rest, but something closer to terror, her eyes wide and her mouth open as if she had died in the middle of a scream. Grace, the midwife, was called to check the body. She had experience with death, having attended many deathbeds over her long life. She looked at Martha's body with the practiced eye of someone who knew what to look for. Then she pulled Thomas aside and spoke to him in a low voice that no one else could hear. What she told him was never written down, but Thomas's reaction was noted by several people. He went pale, stumbled, and had to sit down. His hands were shaking. He looked like a man who had just received terrible news or been faced with a terrible truth. He sent Grace away immediately, sending her back to the quarters with orders not to speak of what she had seen. He ordered that Martha be buried within 24 hours before the body could rot further in the September heat. This was unusual. Wealthy families usually kept the body for several days, allowing time for relatives to arrive and pay their respects. There would be a viewing, a funeral service, a proper mourning time, but Thomas insisted on immediate burial, blaming the heat and Martha's condition, and the need to spare the family extra sadness. The funeral was small and rushed. A few family members, a few close friends, a minister who read from the Bible in a quick way. The coffin was closed. Thomas said that Martha's look would be too upsetting for the family to see. No one was allowed to view the body one last time. Elizabeth Epps arrived just as the coffin was being lowered into the ground. She had ridden hard from her home, having received word of Martha's death only the day before. She was furious that she hadn't been told earlier, that she hadn't been given time to say goodbye, that her sister was being buried with such rude speed. She demanded to see Martha's body one last time. She wanted to see her sister's face to say a proper goodbye, to confirm that Martha was really dead and not just being hidden away again. Thomas refused. He said the coffin had been sealed, that Martha's body was not in a state to be viewed, that it would be too hard for Elizabeth to see. He said that Elizabeth needed to trust him, that he had Martha's best interests at heart, that everything had been done properly. They argued beside the grave, their voices rising, the other mourners watching in uncomfortable silence. Elizabeth accused Thomas of hiding something. Thomas accused Elizabeth of being crazy with grief. The argument grew hot, ugly, threatening to become a public scandal. Finally, Thomas played his final card. He reminded Elizabeth of the parts in his will. He reminded her that her children's futures depended on his kindness, that he had made plans to ensure their money security, that these plans could be changed if Elizabeth proved to be hard. He reminded her that spreading rumors about Martha's death would destroy not only his name, but her own family's chances, that society would not look kindly on a woman who blamed her brother-in-law of wrongdoing without proof. The threat was clear. Silence could be bought, help would be rewarded, fighting would be punished. Elizabeth stepped back from the grave. She watched her sister being buried in silence, her face a mask of grief and rage and helplessness. She watched the earth being shoveled onto the coffin, burying Martha forever, burying the truth along with her, and then she left Monticello and never returned. She cut off all contact with Thomas Jefferson. She refused to visit. She refused to write. She refused to allow her children to have any relationship with their uncle. For the rest of her life, she kept a cold, distant silence that spoke volumes about what she believed had happened to her sister. But before she left, she did one thing that would echo through history. She took Martha's diary. Martha had kept a journal for years recording her thoughts, her fears, her notes about life at Monticello. It was a small leather-bound book that she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her bedroom. She had written in it almost every day, noting her life in careful detail, the births of her children, the deaths of loved ones, her struggles with sickness, her thoughts about Thomas and his work and his character. And in the final months, she had written about Sally Hemings, about the pregnancy, about her fight with Thomas, about what had happened to her at Shadwell Mills. Thomas had searched for the diary after Martha's death, meaning to destroy it. He had gone through Martha's room methodically, looking in every drawer, every trunk, every possible hiding place, but he couldn't find it. The diary had disappeared. Elizabeth had been faster, while Thomas was busy with funeral plans, while everyone was distracted by grief and details. Elizabeth had gone to Martha's room. She knew about the loose floorboard. Martha had shown it to her years ago when they were girls sharing secrets. She had grabbed the diary and hidden it in her own things, and she had taken it with her when she left Monticello. The diary was never published. Elizabeth kept it hidden for the rest of her life, locked in a trunk in her attic. When she died in 1811, she passed it to her daughter with strict orders that it should never be read by anyone outside the family, that it held information too dangerous to tell, that it could destroy names and ruin lives even decades after the events described. The diary passed through several generations of the Epps family, each keeper adding their own note, confirming that the contents were too disturbing to make public. It became a family secret, a load passed from mother to daughter, a proof of something terrible that had happened, but could never be spoken of. In 1873, 91 years after Martha's death, the diary was finally destroyed. Martha's great-great-granddaughter, a woman named Caroline Epps Harrison, burned it in her fireplace. She sat up all night reading the diary page by page, and then feeding each page to the fire, watching the secrets turn to ash. But before she burned it, she wrote a letter to her sister describing what she had found. That letter survived. It's now in a private collection held by descendants of the Epps family, never shown publicly, never discussed in official Jefferson studies. Access to it is restricted, and researchers who ask to see it are usually denied, but a few history experts have been allowed to read the letter under strict conditions of privacy. They report that it contains claims so disturbing that they cannot be published even now, more than 2 centuries after the events described. The letter mentions Shadwell Mills. It mentions Sally Hemings and the baby. It mentions things that were done to Martha during her holding, methods used to break her will and ensure her silence, and it mentions Martha's final words spoken to Thomas on the night before she died. According to the letter, Martha called Thomas to her room and spoke to him with a clarity she hadn't shown in months. The The laudanum had worn off, and her mind was clear for the first time since her return from Shadwell Mills. She told him that she knew what he had done to her. She told him that she would never forgive him. She told him that she had written everything down, that the truth would survive even if she didn't, that his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would eventually know what kind of man he really was. And then she said, "You sent me away to hide your shame, but shame has a way of surviving. Your children will know, history will know, and you will never escape what you've done." Those were her last words. She died that night alone in her locked room with only Mrs. Randolph present. The nurse's official report said that Martha died peacefully in her sleep, but the letter from Caroline Epps Harrison suggests otherwise. It suggests that Martha's death was not natural, that steps were taken to ensure she would never speak again, that the timing was too neat to be accidental. But there is no proof. There is only suspicion. Whispers, a letter that few people have read and fewer still believe. After Martha's death, Thomas Jefferson destroyed almost everything connected to her. He burned her letters, hundreds of them, notes with family and friends spanning years. He burned her personal papers, her drawings, her music. He burned her clothing, saying he couldn't bear to see it. He removed her pictures from the walls and stored them in the attic where they gathered dust for decades. He forbade anyone in the house from speaking her name, saying that it was too painful for him to hear. He was erasing her from history, just as he had erased those 3 months when she disappeared. He was creating a story in which Martha was a tragic figure, a loved wife who died young, a victim of sickness rather than a woman who had been purposefully destroyed by her husband's cheating and cruelty. The official record of Martha Jefferson's life is very empty. We know the dates of her birth and death. We know she married Thomas Jefferson in 1772. We know she bore 6 children, only 2 of whom survived to adulthood. We know she died at 33, supposedly from problems of childbirth, but we know almost nothing about who she was as a person. Her letters were destroyed, her diary was destroyed, her voice was silenced both during her life and after her death. She exists in history as a shadow, a footnote in the story of a great man, a wife who had the bad luck to die young and leave her husband free to follow his destiny. Sally Hemings remained at Monticello for the rest of Thomas Jefferson's life. She bore him 6 children in total, though only 4 survived to adulthood. The children were named Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston. They all had light skin, light enough to pass for white, and they all bore a striking likeness to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas never claimed them publicly. He never freed Sally during his lifetime, but he made plans for her children in his will, freeing them when they came of age. Beverly and Harriet were allowed to run away in their early 20s, disappearing into white society and never looking back. Madison and Eston were formally freed after Thomas's death. Sally herself was never formally freed. Instead, she was allowed to walk away after Thomas died in 1826, a legal trick that gave her freedom without the official papers that might raise questions about why she, alone among hundreds of enslaved people, received this favor. She lived with her sons Madison and Eston in Charlottesville until her death in 1835. She never spoke publicly about her relationship with Thomas Jefferson. She never gave talks, never wrote a book, never confirmed or denied the rumors that had followed her for decades. She kept a dignified silence that protected her children and kept what little privacy she had. But she told her children stories. She told them about their father, about life at Monticello, about the complicated reality of being enslaved by the man who fathered your children. She told them about Martha Jefferson, about what had happened in 1782, about the terrible price Martha paid for discovering the truth, and her children told their children, and those stories survived even when the official history tried to bury them. The Hemings descendants maintained for generations that they were descended from Thomas Jefferson, that Sally Hemings had been his partner, that the relationship had begun when Sally was just a teenager and had continued for decades. For 200 years, these claims were denied by historians and Jefferson experts. They said the stories were impossible, that a man of Jefferson's standing would never engage in such behavior, that the Hemings family was lying or mistaken or trying to claim a link to greatness that they didn't deserve. But in 1998, DNA testing proved what the Hemings family had been saying all along. Thomas Jefferson had fathered at least one of Sally Hemings's children, and probably all of them. The genetic proof was undeniable. The official history had been wrong. The family stories had been right. The stone house at Shadwell Mills burned down in 1790, 8 years after Martha's death. The fire was ruled an accident, a lightning strike during a summer storm. According to the official report, the house was completely destroyed, the stone walls cracked by the heat, the roof collapsed, everything inside reduced to ash, but the timing was suspicious. The fire occurred just days after a former Monticello servant was seen in the area asking questions about the property's history. The servant, a man named Peter Fawcett, who had been sold away from Monticello years earlier, had returned to Virginia and was trying to piece together what had happened to Martha Jefferson. He had heard stories in the slave community, fragments of truth that had been passed down through whispers and coded conversations. He went to Shadwell Mills to see the place for himself, to look for evidence of what had happened there. He was seen by local residents asking about the stone house, trying to find people who remembered 1782. 3 days later, the house burned and Peter Fawcett disappeared. His body was never found. His family never heard from him again. Whether he died in the fire, or whether he met with an accident shortly after, or whether he was killed to silence him, no one knows. The fire destroyed whatever evidence might have remained at Shadwell Mills. The scratches on the walls that Martha had made with her fingernails, the locks on the doors and windows, any physical trace of the 3 months Martha spent held there, all of it was reduced to ash and rubble. The property was abandoned after the fire. The ruins of the stone house were left to be taken back by the forest. Within a generation, few people remembered that Shadwell Mills had ever existed. It disappeared from maps, from records, from memory. Another piece of evidence erased. Another chapter of the story buried. Thomas Jefferson went on to become the 3rd President of the United States, serving from 1801 to 1809. He wrote beautifully about freedom and equality while owning over 600 human beings during his lifetime. He spoke of the evils of slavery while fathering children with an enslaved woman who had no legal right to refuse him. He pushed for education and learning while strictly destroying evidence of his own crimes. He lived to be 83 years old, dying on July 4th, 1826, exactly 50 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. His death was celebrated as the passing of a founding father, a thinker, a president, one of the great men who shaped America's ideals. He was mourned across the nation. Speeches praised his mind, his vision, his gifts to American democracy. No one mentioned Martha. No one mentioned Sally. No one mentioned the 3 months in 1782 when a woman disappeared and returned broken. No one mentioned the stone house in the mountains where terrible things happened. No one mentioned the diary that was hidden and eventually burned. No one mentioned the truth that had been so carefully buried. Thomas Jefferson took his secrets to the grave, and for 200 years those secrets stayed buried. But secrets don't die as easily as people. They linger in the spaces between official records. They survive in family stories and whispered rumors and letters that are read once and then hidden away. They persist in the DNA that connects descendants across centuries. They emerge in the gaps and silences of the historical record, in the questions that historians can't answer, in the documents that were destroyed and the voices that were silenced. Martha Jefferson vanished for 3 months in 1782. The official record says she was receiving medical treatment in Richmond, but the official record is a lie carefully built by a man who understood that history is written by those with the power to control the story. The truth is darker and more human. Martha discovered her husband's relationship with an enslaved girl who was her own half-sister. She faced him with evidence of Sally's pregnancy. And Thomas, faced with a choice between his wife and his good name, chose to remove Martha from society until she could be broken into silence. What happened in that stone house during those 3 months? What ways were used to turn a strong-willed woman into the empty ghost who returned to Monticello? Did Thomas visit her there? Did he explain, justify, apologize, or did he simply leave her in isolation until her mind shattered under the weight of cheating and jail? We will never know for certain. The people who could have told us are long dead, and the records that might have revealed the truth were systematically destroyed. The stone house burned. The diary burned. The witnesses were sold away or silenced or disappeared. Every piece of evidence was carefully removed. Every voice that might have spoken the truth was squashed. But we know this. Martha Jefferson died at 33. Her health destroyed, her spirit broken, her story erased. Sally Hemings lived to be 62, bearing the children of the man who had jailed her mistress, carrying secrets that she would never fully tell. And Thomas Jefferson lived to be 83, celebrated as a founding father, his name intact, his crimes forgotten. History remembers him as the writer of the Declaration of Independence.